It's time now for the final stanza of the day. It's our panel segment, and coming up to facilitate the session, please welcome Karen May back to the stage.
Well, thank you to Gwen for that amazing and powerful story. I first saw Gwen present at the Invictus Symposium, and it was a families symposium, but yet that was the story that I think everyone would take away, and the call to action, which led us to hold this event, really, and make sure that we had families research right at the centre. So I know today has been a lot of research, a lot of context setting. Now, I just want to introduce a couple of the other panellists that you wouldn't have met today. So I'll just introduce, right next to me, Professor Sharon Lawn. Worked with Sharon now for a few years in the research area. Professor Sharon Lawn is Director of Flinders Human Behaviour and Health Research Unit and leads the Mental Health Research Unit for the College of Medicine and Public Health at Flinders University. She has undertaken numerous projects in chronic condition management, self-management, mental health, addictions, consumer and carer perspectives, and health system change. Sharon is a national mental health lived experience consumer carer advocate. I'd also like to invite right next to Sharon, Cleo Field. Cleo came to Australia in 1969 from the USA. In 1971, she met and married her husband, who was serving in the Royal Australian Navy. He served in Vietnam, and they were married for 42 years before he passed away. They have 3 children, and Cleo also now has 6 grandchildren. After Kevin left the Navy in 1973, they moved to Kangaroo Island, where Kevin started to have a breakdown, where it was eventually diagnosed as PTSD. Cleo is active with the state and national boards of the Partners of Veterans Association of Australia, which we've had a lot more to do with in recent times in regards to the new emerging families research projects in Australia, and they've been amazing partners in supporting recruitment into projects. So I'd just like to kick off. There's been a lot of information, a lot of perspectives today. But I'd like to, first of all, address a question to Sharon Lawn. We've heard some of the latest research and programs today on families from Australia, Canada, UK and US and New Zealand and Ireland as part of the UK. And we'll hear some more from Professor Sharon Lawn tomorrow on Australian Partners Study. So Professor Sharon Lawn and Dr. Elaine Waddell conducted the first substantial study of partners of both veterans and first responders and the effect of vicariously living with PTSD. Sharon, I just wonder if you would perhaps comment or add anything in regards to the Australian context and similarities with some of the other context studies we've heard today.
Okay, am I on? All right, so I've been taking a few notes across the day, and I think Gwen very eloquently captured the first point, particularly for all of us, that we're getting to the point where really we want to absolutely advocate that it's the whole family. It's not just the carer or the veteran. Nothing happens in isolation. I think we're all agreeing there. Also, the comment about health literacy and mental health literacy, I think we all agree and have got to the point where we know that more needs to be understood. It's not just about the clinical information. Yeah. The other things that resonated, looking across the research across the countries, very much, and Nicola and others resonated around this, and I think we're all, we've seen enough research just on burden, upon coping, upon the negatives. We want to look to the positives, the resilience, the opportunities, because we are families and we come from families and we know all the good things that happen in families. We also are looking to more longitudinal research as part of all of that. And I'll probably leave it there.
Yeah. Thanks, Sharon. I'd actually now just like to address a question to Cleo. At the end, we will just open up for a few questions from the audience. But Cleo, obviously you have the lived experience as well, and your organisation supports other partners informally at meetings and just through the connections and networks that you guys have been able to build. I'm just wanting to hear a little bit about your observations and perhaps personal experience, some of the priorities you feel, and I know we've had conversations about children and grandchildren and generational issues.
I'd firstly like to thank Danielle. Her research was totally spot on with carers, especially the ones in the Vietnam era. We are in the process of trying to make some changes with DVA. We cannot, at the moment, carers can only accompany their partners to a hospital and then come and pick them up. They do not supply any support for accommodation or travel if you choose to stay there with your partner. What they don't get is that you need to be there. You need to be there for them, and you need to be there for yourself. So that is one of the major issues that we're fighting at the moment. They keep passing it around to the states and saying it's a state issue, and we feel it's a DVA issue and should be solved there. I'll give an example of that is that with Tasmania, they now have to go to Melbourne if they need to be hospitalised. So they can have their carer take them to Melbourne, say, see you later, I'll be back to pick you up. This purely isn't good enough, and we will fight for a long time until we get that changed. As Karen said, I'm very passionate about our children. I feel that especially in the Vietnam era, our children were given no support whatsoever, except when we fought to have them accepted for their lifetime at VVCS counselling, which is now Open Arms. So that's pretty much the only support that they've ever received. We're finding now that our grandchildren are presenting with symptoms and they're being looked after by their grandparents because their children cannot do that. However, they won't take over guardianship because that's a pretty big call. So they're stuck with just doing the best that they can with their grandchildren, and I think this is something that needs to be studied and researched so that hopefully we can move forward and try to solve some of these problems that we're having at the moment. So thank you.
Thanks, Cleo. And yeah, I think the thing that has struck me at some of the meetings and the conversations with the women there is that they are carers of multiple people. They're carers of their husbands who are often very unwell. They're also carers of their adult children who have some serious mental health issues, and they're also then caring for the children of those adult children. So the burden on this group is just massive, and at this point there are not the services there to support that.
But I'd like to put in a little plug for Partners of Veterans, because Partners of Veterans really helped me tremendously after Kevin passed away. I had become socially isolated, and I really didn't realise that that had happened to me, but it just gradually does happen. Your own life doesn't exist anymore. And so through Partners of Veterans, they have allowed me to finally find my feet again. And we start out just socially. That's our grassroots. But we have found, and I would like to say a little plug as well, last week at a national conference, we passed that we will have associate members as well. The associate membership includes immediate family of a veteran, which means that we can now, we never turn anybody away, but now they can actually become members of Partners of Veterans. And that will include the fathers and the mothers and the fathers, the siblings. Our children finally will have a place where they can go, where they can be amongst their peers, people that understand them. And that's their biggest issue, as far as our children goes, is that nobody understands what I'm talking about. So, thank you.
Thank you. And for the first responders, partners, I know Sharon's project took some of that in, but there's certainly a lot more research to be done in that area, and I know there's a few projects out there that are starting to look at that. So I'd just like to address a question to Heidi, Tish and Nicola, whoever wants to go first. Just wondering what some of your takeaways have been today from listening to a bit of the Australian context and how it relates or is similar or dissimilar to some of your contexts. Who wants to go first? Heidi?
I'll talk about one thing. When we were talking about carers just a moment ago, the VA has started a program in the United States for the Caregiver Support Program. So for and it depends who the caregiver is. It doesn't have to be a direct blood, family member. It can be a friend. It's whoever is identified as the caregiver. They provide a stipend, understanding that that individual cannot work full time. And so that's one of the things that the VA has done. I will say the program's not perfect. Initially, it was for those veterans that served in, post 9/11. And now they've gone back to include everybody before that as well. So they really are trying to make an attempt at how can we take care of our caregivers, our family members, also to include once a year being able to go to the VA with your service member, with your veteran, and they ask you, how are you doing? We're going to give you a physical to make sure you're doing all right as well. So while in the United States there's a lot of, people that complain about the program, there is also at least the beginning steps in the right direction, which I would offer out that might be a program that's worth looking at here in Australia as well to mimic.
I think so, definitely, yeah. And we hear a lot more about parents caring for, 20-year-old children that have come back with PTSD from service, and they're not finding a place either to get support. And they're finding
Exactly,
it quite
and the great thing is that the VA does not purely look at, if it's a husband or a spouse or if it's a mother or father. It's the family unit is who you identify as your family. It might be your best friend. It's whoever that individual is.
Thank you.
I think from a research perspective, it's been fascinating to hear kind of the research coming out from Australia, but also Canada and from other colleagues as well from Northern Ireland. We're all different, but there are some clear similarities, and it's kind of what can we learn from each other. I think it's clear from the discussions that have been going on here today that we all want to help and support the armed forces community in that kind of broad context. So how can we take the work that's been done within our different nations and compare and contrast that and learn from that, and then make sure that the services and support mechanisms are in place to support the community and to make sure their needs are being addressed.
Thanks, Nicola. And actually, Heidi, I've got a question for you. I know a discussion that's come up in a lot of our local discussions about families is one of the issues for current serving families where they might have a child with a disability and they're trying to, as they're moving, they're trying to then find new services at each move. And I know in one of your research papers you looked at a model for GPs and trying to set some guidelines around families, whether they be current serving or ex-serving, and how GPs might be able to respond or ask about the health of the carer or the children.
Yeah, I think that this issue hits on a lot of the different kinds of things that we've touched on today. We do have, I think, Gwen, I think you said 1.6% of Australians are serving. I think that's not unusual in other Commonwealth countries. There's a very small number of people are serving, and so unless you're from a military family with that kind of storied tradition, then you don't have that same kind of cultural awareness about what service looks like and what it means and how it affects the just day-to-day rhythms of your family and all those different dimensions. And I think that we see that in our civilian healthcare providers. So depending upon what your country's healthcare system service looks like, I believe that all of our Commonwealth folks, the families, are accessing the publicly funded civilian services. I think that's right. I think so. What we've found is that with the move away from centralized military housing and schooling has really eroded a lot of that kind of community cultural awareness about what these things might look like, and depending upon where you live. So, in Kingston we have a very large military base, but it's a trickle deployment. So the community is never aware when anyone comes or goes because there's 17 different units. But if you're in one of the infantry bases in those communities, like everyone goes to the community centers to say goodbye because it's a big group of people moving out. So there's a different kind of sense of the social connectivity, but it plays out then into your schools and into your healthcare providers, and then whether or not they see you as connected to a military family in that kind of polarized way, where you're either, resilient because we need you to be, or you're broken because you happen to be in a military family or the family of a first responder. And so what I always say in terms of that resilience thing, if you want to hear me really talk about something for about an hour, catch me at the bar, and I'll tell you all the issues that I have with the kind of ethical nuances of perpetuating resiliency as a must-do for military families. The take-home for me, we're all resilient until we're not. And enough stuff comes at you, I don't care what you came with, you're going down. That's it. So it's really just not, about your character, your moral fiber. And we have to be very careful about the expectations we place on families, because when we tell them they're resilient, the ones who we're most worried about are the ones who are less and less likely to say, hey, I'm not doing so well. Oh, but military families are resilient. Oh, well then, forget it.
We can be resilient until we're not. And then how we need to be able to take off that brave face and ask for help.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm just going to actually open up to the floor for any questions. And I was just going to say, when we look at the serving family scenario, when we add police into that, when we add firefighters into that, ambulance, our SES, our CFS in Australia, we have this vast country, we have issues with bushfires, we have remote areas and roads, and we have this incredible workforce. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but our volunteer workforce, basically our country would stop without our volunteer firefighters and SES workers who attend the car accidents and fires and events that are happening in those areas. So we start to look at the serving family profile across those sort of numbers, it becomes quite significant.
Tanya from the Premier's Advocate for Suicide Prevention. It's not so much a question but some information after listening to Gwen speak. Doesn't matter how many times I listen to lived experiences in the conferences that I attend, I'm a sympathy crier and it just always resonates. I think that shows that we care and we're very compassionate to people who are in this space. You did mention that there was not a lot of support for you as a family. The Premier's Advocate for Suicide Prevention, Honourable John Dawkins, that was here this morning, Off the back of his appointment, the Premier's Council on Suicide Prevention was established, and Nathan is a veterans representative on that council. One of the outcomes of the council in the last 2 months was for a referral mechanism to be put into place and embedded into the position of the Detective Senior Sergeant First Class Trevor Ray. He attends all the suicides across the state. So that referral mechanism is now embedded into his position, where there are support services offered to the families within the first 24 hours of a suicide. So he will actually approach the family and give them all of the resources they need to actually access those services. So while it's a very small step in what we're doing, it is at least a start for families who don't know where to go.
Excellent, thank you. I think that's wonderful. After Pete's death, we had an enormous amount of support. I think it was in the from the time, well, previous to his stroke, and then once he was home, I had no contact from his unit. I had no idea what support there was, and even letting the unit know that something was wrong with him was risky in terms of them showing him the door versus him being able to stay in. And I think that's what I'm talking about. You know, when families have a diagnosis or know what the diagnosis would be, and they see post-traumatic stress in their house, they think, okay, well, if they get support, that's enough. If they're in therapy, that's enough. But like I said, it isn't. And the families, I guess I would, if I could wave my magic wand, what I would like to see really is not only policy and legislation that actually includes the family and the carers, and doesn't just give us lip service like our Veterans Covenant that did for 18 months and then we didn't get in there, but that actually shows us or helps us figure out what to do to know how to manage that, to not feel like we're walking on those eggshells as much, and to figure out how to take care of ourselves and the member when they have mental health issues. Because that's the piece that we're missing. Like all the research today, I was like, yes, 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 yes. And now what? So what? What do I do as a family member? What are those early interventions? And those questions are still real for families and carers.
Hi, Julia Dunsmore. I work in the area of terrorism and disaster support, but one of the other components, I'm president of the National Association for Loss and Grief. And one of the things that's come out of a lot of the work that we've been doing with PTSD is the fact that so very often the grief side of anything to do with the suffering because of trauma, it just doesn't get airplay. And for a lot of the families and for a lot of the first responders, you know, what they're saying is that, again, that pain of the grief that's associated with that really needs attention, I guess, is what a lot of people are saying. And there seems to be a fear in any of the trauma conferences to actually look at grief that is part of that. And some of the work that Holly Priggerson has done has shown that in chronic PTSD, there is often some sort of very significant loss, whether it's the loss of a mate, and in the services, you know, when somebody who they're very intensely part of that friendship group or colleague group is killed, and it's sort of not connected that could be driving, you know, some of the PTSD side of things. So
Thank you.
Family and
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right in that grief and loss in the process of the person perhaps that you married or got together with changing and losing or feeling like you're losing that person in that process. And for the children too, that experience of loss when someone, as we spoke about in the masterclasses this morning, becomes numb, and so they're non-emotional, then perhaps not engaged. So yeah, a very real situation.